Sure, Mark. Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Well, I'll try to keep my comments brief, although I love to drone on. I will try not to do that. I will touch on both studies, both the one we're releasing today and the one from last week, because the one today builds on the one from last week. The first study, as we say, was released last week, and it dealt with all immigrant households, legal and illegal, that are in the Census Bureau's data. In the report released today, we divide legal and illegal immigrants and look at their welfare use separately. Immigrants, or the foreign-born in Census Bureau parlance, are individuals who are not U.S. citizens at birth. It includes naturalized citizens, it includes green card holders, illegal immigrants, and a relatively modest number of long-term visitors, such as guest workers and foreign students who show up in Census Bureau data. Now, as I say, let me focus first on all immigrants, and then I'll move on to the legal-illegal distinction. To study immigrant welfare, we used the Census Bureau's Survey of Income and Program Participation. It's also referred to as the SIP, S-I-P-P. While its complexity makes it difficult to use, there is widespread agreement that is by far the best data that the government collects on welfare use for households, families, individuals, what have you. So what does it show? Well, the SIP, I'm going to say that right, the SIP shows that households headed by immigrants use welfare at significantly higher rates than natives, even higher than indicated by other census surveys. That's one of our big findings. There's another census survey that has traditionally been used to study immigrant welfare. It's called the CPS, or Current Population Survey. In March of each year, they oversample minorities and ask a lot of questions about income and use of welfare programs. And that survey showed that immigrants did have higher welfare use rates, but the gap between immigrants and natives wasn't as high. In the SIP, the more accurate of the surveys, the one we used, you get an even bigger gap between immigrants and natives, but both groups have higher welfare use in the SIP than in that other survey, the CPS. Now, overall, we found that in 2012, of all immigrants, legal and illegal, 51% of households accessed one or more of the major welfare programs. Typically 2 or 3 at a time, of course, because these programs are all linked. The comparison figure to the 51% is 30% for the native-born. Welfare in this study, in case you're wondering, includes Medicaid, the cash programs, mainly TANF and SSI, the food programs, WIC, food stamps and free lunch, and the housing programs, both public housing and subsidized housing. Now, we also found, interestingly, that welfare use is high for both newly arrived immigrants and the well-established. For example, of immigrant households headed by someone who'd been here for more than 20 years, 48% accessed one of the major welfare programs. No single program explains the higher overall rate of immigrants. Even if you start excluding programs, which we do in the study, you still find that the immigrants have the higher rate. In a little more detail, immigrants have significantly higher use of food stamps, 40 versus 22% than natives. If we compare to Medicaid, 42% of immigrant households receive some form of Medicaid, 23% of native households. Immigrant use of cash is somewhat higher, 12 versus 10%, and use of housing programs is about the same. Now, welfare use also, we found, varies among immigrant groups. For example, immigrants from Central America and Mexico, and that's how the data is grouped. We can't divide that. About 73% of those households access one or more welfare programs. That's the highest of any of the groups we could look at by country. And for those from South Asia, have the lowest rate. That'd be like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. That'd be about 17% accessed welfare. So big differences between immigrant groups. And part of the reason, we'll come back to this, I think, throughout the whole discussion, is education levels. The least educated immigrants tend to come from Central America and Mexico, and the most educated come from South Asia, and the welfare use rates reflect that. Because people with less education tend to earn less and be more likely to be eligible for programs. People with less education also have higher fertility, so they're more likely to have kids, and that also helps them access programs or qualify for them. Which gets to the main point. I guess one of the key findings is, look, many immigrants struggle to support their children, and a large share of welfare use is received on behalf of U.S.-born children. It would be fair to say that what happens is that many immigrants come to America have a child or more than one child, but are unable to support those children, and so a large share of immigrants turn to the taxpayer to feed and house and provide health care for their kids. However, one interesting finding is that even when we're, again, looking at all immigrants, legal and illegal, even when we look at households without any children in them, the immigrant rate was still statistically higher, 30% for the immigrants and 20% for the native-born. So the results often reflect the presence of children, but when we exclude children, this very significant difference between immigrants and native households continues. Now, it must be remembered that the welfare system is designed to help low-income workers, especially those with children, and this describes many immigrants. So when we looked at households with only a worker in them, at least one worker, sometimes multiple workers, it doesn't make much difference to the welfare use rates. 51% of immigrant households used welfare, even though there was a worker present during 2012, compared to 28% of native-born workers. It didn't make much difference to either of the numbers. And that's because the vast majority of households using welfare have a worker. If you had to put, though, the findings in kind of a bumper sticker with regard to the high rates of immigrant workers accessing these programs, there's a high cost to cheap labor, might be a way to put it. Now, this is one of the central findings, which may not surprise welfare researchers, but it may surprise members of the public. Welfare and work go together. Let me just give you a quick example. A family of 2 children and a parent, mother or father, working, making $20,000 a year, qualify for just about every non-cash welfare program there is in just about every state. And that would include things like food stamps and WIC and free school lunch and Medicaid, public housing, and so forth. If their monthly income is low enough for parts of the year, then the family would also be able to receive cash programs as well, at least for the times when their income is low. The large share of immigrants with low levels of education and resulting low incomes partly and mostly actually explains their high welfare use. Immigrant households, for example, are more than 3 times as likely as native households to be headed by someone who has not graduated high school. The welfare use rates for less educated immigrants are incredibly high. So if you looked at a household headed by an immigrant who doesn't have a high school education, which is about 1/4 of all immigrants, 76% of those households access welfare. Just to give you an example. Now, although these numbers may seem shockingly high, no one has disputed the accuracy of our report. The main response, mostly by Open Borders libertarians, has been that immigrants may use more welfare than natives, but poor immigrants, or less educated immigrants, use slightly less than poor natives. So I guess not to worry. Now, this is true for some programs, but as we show in the report, it's not true for others. But it's kind of besides the point. Immigrants' poverty rate is about 50% higher than the poverty rate for natives. The welfare use rates simply reflect this reality. The fundamental question is, does it make sense for our country to have an immigration system that produces an immigrant flow in which a large and significant share are less educated than the native population and is therefore significantly poor on average and makes heavy use of welfare? Now, it's worth mentioning that, and I won't go into great detail, that you can kind of try to see the impact of refugees and asylees on this data. They have more quick access to welfare than anyone else. They're allowed into the country for humanitarian reasons, but they don't seem to make that much difference. There's some other data we can look at. That's not what's driving the numbers. They make up only about 13% of legal immigrants and a smaller fraction of all immigrants, because all immigrants include illegal immigrants. So they're not driving these numbers. Their welfare use rates, as far as we can tell, are not particularly high relative to other immigrant groups. Another interesting aside, I think, is that in addition to the cost to taxpayers, these figures probably do have political implications that are worth thinking about. The high welfare use of immigrants may help to explain, for example, why survey data shows strong majorities of voters in immigrant communities tend to be supportive of government programs and big government. And I think maybe the use of welfare, reflects that. And so that's why the policy preferences, if you will, if immigrants generally tend to be supportive of government, big government, if you will. Now, turning to welfare use by legal status. That report that we're releasing today, again, used the SIP, the same data. Now, but the SIP has 2 questions in it that are very interesting that I could explain in the question-answer period if you like, but they make it a lot easier to identify illegal immigrants in the SIP. They ask about, did you come legally? Did you change your status? And it looks like most people who are here illegally do answer those questions honestly. And that doesn't mean we can get all the illegals that way. What we do is we then use other questions in the survey to get the full picture for illegal immigrants. But the SIP is much easier to use in that respect. What we find when we look at legal versus illegal immigrants is that both households use a lot of welfare. Our best estimate is that 49% of households headed by legal immigrants use 1 or more welfare programs in 2012. Again, the comparison is 30% for native households. Households headed by legal immigrants have higher welfare rates than natives overall. And for cash programs, 14% versus 10%, food programs 36 versus 22, and Medicaid 39 versus 23. Use of housing programs is similar. Further, legal immigrant households, it must be remembered, account for 3/4 of all immigrant households, and they account for about 3/4 of all immigrant households using welfare. So they use welfare about as in proportion to their share of the immigrants, of the overall immigrants. We also estimate, I mean, this may be surprisingly high, but it really isn't when you consider the overall rates. We also estimate that of legal immigrant households with children, 72% access 1 or more welfare programs. The rate for natives is also high, it must be pointed out, at 52%. But again, maybe the way to describe it is at a time when lots of Americans seem to be struggling to provide for their own children, we have a legal immigrant flow that's adding folks who struggle even more to support their own children. As is the case with immigrants overall, one of the reasons legal immigrants have significantly higher welfare use is the large share with modest levels of education. But here's something that is surprising, that is not that easy to explain, and it's an area in need of further research. We also found that even among households headed by people with a bachelor's degree, those headed by a legal immigrant used welfare at double the rates of households headed by natives headed by a person with a bachelor's degree. Now, there's several reasons probably for this, but it is puzzling. You would expect that the welfare use rates of the most educated would be very low, but they're not. They're pretty low among the native-born at 13% if you consider that low, but at 26%, 1 out of 4 of these households headed by someone with a bachelor's or graduate degree in the immigrant community access welfare. This suggests that there are other causes to high welfare use among immigrants, like culture. It also indicates certainly that the social networks that immigrants rely on to get jobs, find an apartment, are also very effective at helping them navigate the welfare system. Looking at households headed by immigrants in the country illegally, we estimate that 62% used 1 or more welfare programs in 2012. Households headed by illegal immigrants tend to have much higher rates of food use, 57 versus 22 for natives. So they're using a lot of food stamps, a lot of housing, a lot of free school lunch, and a lot of WIC. Very large fraction of illegal immigrants have their children signed up for Medicaid, 51% do versus 23% of households headed by the native-born. However, use of cash programs by illegal immigrants is lower at about 5% compared to that 10% for natives, and there's not much difference in the use of housing programs. Now, it's very important to understand that there is a child present in 86% of illegal immigrants' households using welfare. And this is the primary way that these households access programs. If we just focus on illegal immigrant households with children, 87% of those households access 1 or more welfare programs. So what does all this mean, whether we're looking at immigrants overall, legal or illegal? All this means that when someone like President Bush says all that matters is matching a willing worker with a willing employer, these data suggest that is a grossly inadequate way of thinking about immigration. There are enormous implications, particularly for bringing in unskilled workers for the American taxpayers. Now, of course, less educated natives also use a lot of welfare, but they're already here. And of course, they're already part of our national community. So there's no added cost. Immigration is different. You'd be bringing in new people who would then turn to the taxpayer. Now, very briefly, many of you may wonder, how is it that immigrants can use so much welfare, given that the 96 welfare reform law in particularly tried to curtail immigrant welfare use? And on top of that, there's a long-standing idea called the public charge, which is if you become dependent on the welfare system, technically you can be deported. Well, let me just say this about public charge. Let me say this. We have an appendix starting on page 25 of the larger report, the first report, explaining why the restrictions on immigrant welfare don't work as intended and likely never will. But just to give you two quick examples, there's a thing called the public charge, which says, again, that if you become dependent on welfare, that you could be deported for that. But it turns out that in all of 2012, despite the numbers I've just gone over with you, only one immigrant was ever investigated for public charge. And that case was dropped. So I think it'd be fair to say that that's not a very important provision. Let me give you another example. Part of the 96 welfare law was that you had to go to your sponsor for support if you got in trouble in the first 10 years, basically, and you weren't supposed to go to the taxpayer, as it were. But there's a thing called the immigrant exception. The indigent exception. And if you are an indigent immigrant, that is, you're poor, then you don't need to go to your sponsor. You just apply for it and you get it for 12 years and you can get that renewed. So the whole idea of going to a sponsor is entirely negated by that policy. In short, let me summarize by saying that restrictions from the 96 law actually only apply to some programs. They don't apply to most immigrants because most immigrants have been here longer. Most immigrants are legal and have been here longer. There are all these exceptions. As I said, states often provide welfare with their own money, and some provisions are entirely unenforced. It's also the case that immigrants can receive benefits on behalf of their U.S.-born children who are awarded U.S. citizenship at birth and thus have welfare eligibility like anyone else. It's very common for a household getting food stamps or TANF to be what's referred to as a child-only household. And this is actually true not just of immigrants. And if the parents don't meet the requirements for TANF or food stamps, then basically the benefit comes in the name of the children. And this seems to be very common among immigrants. In fact, otherwise ineligible immigrants, illegal immigrants or legal immigrants, are actually allowed to live in public housing if they have just one U.S.-born child. So I think that is very difficult to think of a way in which you would be somehow barring immigrants from using those programs through their U.S.-born children. The bottom line is, practically and politically, barring low-income immigrants and their children from welfare after they've been allowed into the country is probably not possible. Even among illegal immigrants, it's difficult. After all, are we really going to cut off low-income children, disabled legal immigrants, and the working poor from welfare once they're here? In a country that often makes public policy by heart-rendering anecdote, that seems very unlikely indeed. Let me conclude by arguing that it is a mistake to see the high welfare use rates of immigrants as a moral failing on their part. Most immigrants come to work, and most do work. It merely reflects, if you will, the intersection of three trends: a modern U.S. economy which offers low wages for the less educated, an expansive welfare system, and an immigration system that admits large numbers of less educated legal immigrants and tolerates illegal immigration. It's also not particularly helpful to compare today's immigrants with those who arrived 100 years ago. You hear this all the time, because there was no welfare state 100 years ago, so how is it really relevant? We don't know what your ancestors might have done if you're native born, because there was no welfare state, but I'm betting if there was, they would have accessed it at very high rates too. Now, the important thing is, under the current system, some 20 to 25 million new legal immigrants will settle in the country in the next 2 decades under the current system. That's a lot of folks. The overwhelming majority will be allowed into the country regardless of their skills, mainly because they have a relative here. If we want to avoid high immigrant welfare use in the future, we will have to move to an immigration system that's more selective, selecting highly educated immigrants who are unlikely to use these programs. If we choose not to make those changes, we must accept without complaint the welfare costs created by the current system. Thank you.